The inclusion of technology in a fantasy role-playing game can be a somewhat contentious topic, with people often falling into one of two extreme camps. On one side, you have people who fear that the addition of technological innovations such as gunpowder or clockwork technology might spoil the fantastical elements of the story they're trying to tell. And on the other extreme, pew 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 pew. Today, we're going to be talking about guns and gears for Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Stick 'em up. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who is always willing to allow character options labeled Explode into my games. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we're going to be doing another book review for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and we're going to be talking about Guns and Gears for Pathfinder 2e. This is a book that introduces a ton of new gun and gear, go figure, related character options that your players can use in your campaigns. We're going to talk about what I like about this book, some of the criticisms I have of this book, and I'll give you my insights into the value that I think it might bring your gaming table. Now, up front, as with any review that I do on this channel, I always encourage you to take these reviews with a grain of salt. Please remember that this review is the random thoughts of some guy on the internet, and that the best review you can ever get of any gaming product is to check a product out for yourself. So I strongly encourage you, if you have the opportunity to borrow this book from a friend, or maybe check this book out at a gaming store or gaming convention, something like that, it is always better to try before you buy. I will let you know that today's review is not sponsored in any way. Paizo did not send me this book for review. This is something that I purchased of my own free will for use at my gaming table. And I'm just going to be offering my sincere thoughts on a product that I decided to buy, and hopefully giving you some insight into this product and whether or not it might be something that you would consider a positive purchase as well. But with that intro out of the way, let's get started. So if you've seen any of my other review videos on this channel, you know that I like to begin at the end, start with my overall thoughts on the product, and then work my way through the product to help you see how I arrived at my conclusions. And I have already alluded to the fact that this book, Guns and Gears, is probably going to be a polarizing product for some people in the gaming community. This book is all about technology, guns and gears. If you like steampunk fantasy, then this book is going to have a ton of stuff that you will probably enjoy. But if you don't like the idea of adding technological advancement to your high fantasy games, then this book could be quite abrasive to you. And I definitely think that that is a valid consideration when you are considering whether or not you want to purchase this book. You do need to ask yourself, is Guns and Gears going to support a playstyle that I enjoy? Or is this something I would rather not have at my gaming table? Now, I'll go ahead and let you know where I'm coming from personally. I grew up on RPGs like Final Fantasy, which often mixed classic high fantasy and magic content with technological content as well. One of my favorite Final Fantasy games was Final Fantasy II or Final Fantasy IV, depending on which numbering system you use. And one of the central storylines in that game was this conflict between the old ways in magic and this new dangerous technology that had been unleashed on the planet. I grew up with a lot of my favorite stories mixing these two elements together, so I really enjoy bringing steampunk-style stories or guns and gears into my fantasy games. It doesn't really break the immersion for me, but I do understand how certain settings, certain styles of games could find this particular content to be, well, just a bad fit. So before I give a grade, before I give my big picture thoughts, let me just say that if this is not your style of content, it's completely understandable to pass on this book. However, Paizo has taken some time to address some of the concerns that go with mixing classical fantasy with guns and gears. It's worth noting that this book has what's called a modular design. It's divided very cleanly into gear section and very cleanly into gun section, so that if you want one but not both, you have that option and it can go either way. And then if you want to use all of the content, you can easily do that as well. So Paizo has taken the steps to say that as a game master, you can introduce the things that you want while leaving the other things to the side. If you enjoy Clockwork Dragons, but you don't think firearms are a good fit for your campaign, then use the gears material, pitch the guns material. On the flip side, if you're okay with some basic firearms, but you don't like the idea of crazy automatons running around all over the place, you can take the stuff from the guns chapter and leave the stuff from the gears chapter. It's set up so that you can easily do that. Another thing I should note about this book is there is no Numeria-based content. Numeria is the Lost Omens sci-fi setting for Pathfinder 2e, and that's the place you want to go if you want to bring like laser guns into your fantasy game. None of the Numeria content is in this book, and they even explicitly say that they excluded that content from this book on purpose. They wanted to keep the relative level of technology low for what they were producing here. Basically, they're saying that you have to wait for Lost Omens Numeria before you get your lightsaber. That's how it plays out. But on top of that, they do take the time to discuss the idea of integrating firearms and gear-based technology into a fantasy setting. And one of the things that they talk about is that due to the influence of magic in the Golarion setting, that technology has not advanced as quickly as it did in this world. They point out that in our society, guns and bows actually coexisted for about 900 years, and that because of the slow progress of technology in Golarion, that coexistence has lasted longer, and the people who live in Golarion are more adept at responding to technology with magical improvements, better armor, that kind of thing. Essentially, the meta of this particular game is, while firearms are good, while gear technology is interesting, there are other options in the setting that can compete with and maybe even exceed the power level of what firearms or gear technology can bring to the table. In other words, the existence of firearms does not have to negate the existence of other weapons, and having crazy clockwork automatons running around doesn't mean that your wizard also can't build some magical golems. All of these things have developed together in world, allowing for a relative balance mechanically between your classic fantasy and steampunk fantasy style content. Overall, I appreciate the fact that Paizo has taken the time to do this, and I think it is a healthy way to approach this. It allows this content to exist for people who might enjoy this style of story, while at the same time not pushing out other types of content that people would come to a game like Pathfinder 2e in order to play. So I feel like Paizo has struck a good middle ground here, but it is fair to say that this content is going to strongly appeal to some players and may not feel so comfortable for other players, and that is a consideration that you need to think about if you're looking at this book. But wow, that was a lot of preamble to actually give you my overall thoughts. So what are my overall thoughts on Guns and Gears? Well, I'm going to be honest, I was hesitant to give Guns and Gears this grade, but I feel like it earned it. I give Guns and Gears an A- overall as an RPG product. In fact, I'll go ahead and say this, Guns and Gears is, in my opinion, the best player resource that Paizo has published in terms of its Pathfinder 2e books. I love this book. I think it's extremely well done, and with the heavy caveat that you must enjoy this style of story, if you enjoy this style of story, I think you will get a ton of use out of this book. If you saw my previous review of Secrets of Magic, one of the things I talked about in that book was sort of a toolkit around the subject of magic that occasionally catered to game masters and occasionally catered to players. It kind of served two sides of the coin. Guns and Gears is different. I feel like this book is pretty solidly geared towards players. Don't get me wrong, there is some fun stuff for game masters in this book, and I'll point out a few of my favorites as we go along, but overall, I do feel like this book is definitely more of a toy box for your players. And when it comes to reviewing books, when you have a product that is very heavily focused on giving your players options, that, in my mind, really raises the overall utility of the book. I'm a storyteller, I love Game Master focused content, but the reality is, over years of gaming, I have discovered that it's the stuff that is geared towards your players that tends to be brought out at the gaming table the most often. And with Guns and Gears, we actually have a book that caters very heavily to players, caters very heavily to specific play styles, and I feel as long as you are interested in those styles, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of this. In fact, I like this book more than the Advanced Player's Guide. And I feel like my players are going to get more mileage out of this book than the Advanced Player's Guide, and that honestly says something about the quality of this book. Now, obviously I love this book, but before we dive into the chapter by chapter, are there any concerns or criticisms that I have of this book? And I feel really nitpicky here, but yes, there are some criticisms that I have. And one of them is the modular design that we discussed earlier. Earlier I mentioned that Paizo has set this book up where it has a gear section and a gun section. And it is done that way so that as a game master, if you want guns, you can add guns. If you want gears, you can add gears, but you don't have to add both. And I respect that Paizo did that because they wanted to make it easier for game masters to add what they want to add to their story. But for me personally, I don't think I have ever met a storyteller that would add only one of those. I have certainly met storytellers who would exclude both, and I understand excluding both, but I don't think I've ever met a storyteller who would just straight up say, I only want guns or I only want gears. I feel like most storytellers who would accept one would actually accept both. And while there are some complexity differences between these two sections, overall I feel like this modular design, this separation of the two, is ultimately unnecessary. Functionally, what happens is you end up with two different sections for new classes. You end up with two different sections for new backgrounds, two different sections for new archetypes, two different sections for new equipment, two different sections for new siege equipment. And honestly, I don't like that. Again, I feel very nitpicky here. I understand why Paizo did what they did, but just for me personally, I feel like most of the game masters who like one half of this content would like both, and so I feel like the decision to pull them apart just makes this book a little bit harder to use for very little gain. And I don't know, this is something you guys can chat about in the comments section. Let me know, do you think it is better to have these two sections pulled apart, or do you think it would have been easier to use the book if they had just mixed the two sections together? I'll admit I'm conflicted on this one. Also, another small nitpick that we've kind of already talked about, the exclusion of Numeria content. Now, I realize there's only so much content they can do with Numeria, and so they probably want to save that for the Lost Omens book. But they kind of present it in the book as they wanted to keep the technology at a certain level, and they only wanted to go so far, and then later on down the road, they could add the sci-fi and the other advanced technologies if they so desired. Again, I understand that, and there's probably some wisdom in that presentation, but given the modular design of this book, I don't understand why they didn't just add another module for those much more advanced, much crazier options that the Numeria setting or other similar concepts might represent. And my reason is this: are they going to do a separate book for every single technology level that you could possibly add to the game? I mean, they're probably not going to do that, and so at some point, they're probably going to start lumping different groups of technology together, which kind of begs the question, why didn't they do that here? Again, this is super nitpicky, and if you disagree with me on this point, it's totally fair. It just feels a little bit weird to me, and while I understand the decisions that Paizo made, I'm also not sure if I personally would have gone the same direction. I also have some mild criticisms on one of the new classes, the Inventor, but we'll talk about that when we actually talk about Chapter 1 for Gears characters. So, you know what? Let's start that now. Alright, so let's dive into the individual chapters themselves and talk about some of the content that this book contains. And here is where one of the major themes of this review is going to start, and that is, wow, Paizo crammed a ton of content into this book. I am not joking. I am going to be flying through some of the examples, and I promise you, I am just skimming the surface. There is so much in this book. Chapter 1 is Gears characters. This is all about options for characters who are themed around the concept of gears. The most notable portion of this chapter is the new class, the Inventor class. It is an intelligence-based martial class that is built around the idea of a character who builds and designs their own unique mechanical goodies that they then use to, well, succeed on their adventures. And I will say this for the Inventor, they come with some absolutely beautiful first level abilities. They have the Overdrive ability, where they can attempt a crafting check to basically boost the power of whatever devices it is that they are using, allowing it to deal more damage. And then the Explode activity. I love the Explode activity. You set off your invention and make it explode in a giant burst around you. This is amazing, it's wonderful, I love it. Good job, Paizo. I don't care about the balance, I love the flavor here. I definitely think that the Inventor occupies a very unique and interesting design space. It is a martial character, but it is a martial character that draws from its mental attributes, from intelligence, rather than primarily from its physical attributes, and that allows for very creative, very unique approaches to combat. And I feel like there are plenty of examples in pop culture and literature, like Iron Man, that you can use to pull inspiration for an Inventor character. The core of the Inventor is the Inventor's innovation, which comes in one of three kinds. You can have a weapon innovation, an armor innovation, or a construct innovation. And this is sort of your unique thing that you really focused on, that you've built for yourself, that you just get to push to absurdity. If you have a weapon innovation, you have put so many gadgets and doodads on your weapon that you now have something absurd like a chainsaw sword, and it's fun. Or if you have an armor innovation, your armor doesn't just block physical blows but can protect you from energy damage and give you access to unique forms of movement. Or you can go with the construct innovation and build your own battle companion. Right now in my home game, I have a player who's actually playing an Inventor, and they built their own octopus bot that runs around and fights the undead in my game. I haven't gotten far enough in my home game yet to really stress test the Inventor in terms of balance, but on fun factor, my player is definitely enjoying it. Overall, I think the Inventor is a very welcome addition to the game, and there is just so much creative opportunity with this class that I feel like you could get a lot of mileage. In Pathfinder 1st Edition, I had a player who wanted to play an Inventor, and there wasn't an Inventor class available, so I reskinned the Alchemist in Pathfinder 1E so that they could play their Inventor-style character. And it worked, it was a good experience, but now that I'm seeing a fully published Inventor that is separate from the Alchemist, it is its own class and its own thing, it would have been a much better fit for what my player wanted to do back then, and I really love the addition of this class, the Pathfinder 2E. Now I will say, on the Inventor, I do have one very notable criticism. I have not playtested this class extensively, so there may be other issues that I haven't noticed yet, but I am going to say this. The armor innovation for the Inventor disappoints me. Because you are not a tank. You're hard to kill, don't get me wrong. The armor innovation is amazing at protecting you. But when we think of tanks in Pathfinder 2E, we think of players that have the capacity to protect members of their team, to do different actions or reactions to help keep their team safe. And the armor innovation, at least as far as I've found, and I've read through it several times, there aren't really any protect your ally options for the armor innovation. And that just hurts because when you think armor innovation Inventor, your first thought is, I'm going to be the team tank, but no, you're not the team tank. You are still an offensive character who just happens to have better defenses for yourself. So when it comes to the Inventor, that did come as a bit of a letdown to me. But the Inventor is not the only thing in Chapter 1. You also get a new ancestry for Pathfinder 2E, which is the Automaton ancestry. Now someday I hope to do a series on this channel that takes a look at ancestries with a more critical eye, because I think there's a lot of interesting things regarding ancestries in this game. But I'll go ahead and say this. Automaton is one of those ancestries I really want to dig into, because Paizo found a very interesting way to approach the concept of ancestry mechanically. I am very intrigued by what they did here, and Automaton is one of the genuine surprises in this book. I'm not going to dive into everything. The basic story is that the Jitska Imperium in the Golarion setting, as it was collapsing, some of the people in that particular society found a way to preserve their consciousness inside of these automatons, and you are now kind of playing a mind out of time if you choose to play one of those. It's very interesting. I love it. Hopefully someday we can dive into that a little bit deeper, but it's really cool. This chapter also offers new backgrounds. It offers some common backgrounds like the mechanic or the toy maker, as well as some rare backgrounds that they totally swear are not being ripped off of Tony Stark, such as the Saved by Clockwork background. Of course, I think my favorite of the rare backgrounds in this chapter has to be the When You Wish Upon a Star, Wished Alive rare background. There's just some really fun stuff in here. And then this chapter ends with a selection of archetypes based around gear characters, and there are a wide array of archetypes here. You get the Inventor multi-class archetype, which is one that you would expect, but you also get 5 other archetypes that take on a variety of roles. Now, if you're a fan of this channel, you already know the archetypes that jumped out to me. There is a vehicle driver and vehicle engineer archetype, so that if you really want to have vehicles as a major element of your game, it can actually be something that multiple members of the party get to participate in, They've got archetypes not just for driving the vehicle, but upgrading the vehicle. I absolutely love it. Chapter 1 is loaded, and we haven't even talked about the fun gear toys. Let's move on to Chapter 2. So, since we're talking about characters who enjoy new gear, let's ask what new gear is available with Chapter 2 Gear's Equipment. Now, the introduction to this chapter does kind of break down the different new equipment offerings into some categories. It gives 3 general categories that gear equipment can fall into: clockwork, Stasian, and steam. The most common type of gear is clockwork gear, and it is pretty much what it sounds like, the high fantasy equivalent of clockwork. The book states that this is the most common, the most readily available, and the type of gear technology that most people in Golarion would have the best chance of interacting with, seeing, or obtaining. Next up is Stasian technology, which is essentially technology that utilizes electricity through the use of Stasian coils, or by another more familiar name, Tesla coils, to harness electricity and get unique benefits out of it. And then the final category, the rarest category, and one that, as far as I can tell, mostly seems to be limited to a few unique vehicles, is steam technology, which is essentially steam-driven vehicles of different kinds. There may be some other steam gear that I have overlooked, but I feel like the most prominent examples are definitely in the vehicle section of this chapter. From there, the chapter breaks down into different categories of gear that you can find: combat gear, gadgets, siege weapons, if anything's going to compete with vehicles for my favorite, snares and hazards, Stasian tech, and of course, the one you know I'm obsessed with, vehicles. Each section of this chapter is going to offer a wide variety of different options, and it would take way too much work to hit every single option available, but I will talk about a few of my favorites. One of my favorite new weapons is the spy movie classic, the Dart Umbrella, but you can also pick up options like the repeating crossbow, or insane options like the backpack catapult. I don't know who wrote this, but whoever it was, thank you. Moving on to gadgets, you get a wide variety of different mechanically themed items that players might be able to use. One of my favorites is the Material Essence Disruptor. And the idea behind these is that they are special components that have been assembled to help disrupt arcane and primal spells, essentially serving as a non-magical form of counter magic. That's cool. I've seen this pop up from time to time in stories that I've read, but I don't know if I've ever seen this directly done inside of a game, so I think it's pretty cool that you can have your Gears character responding to like maybe a fireball spell with the steampunk equivalent of a fire extinguisher. They also have a nice section on siege weapons, although, Paizo, we need to talk. You specifically note in this section that I am not allowed to use a battering ram for attacks of opportunity, and I just want to say I do not think you appreciate the madness that me and my players bring to the gaming table. But overall, this section is going to give you rules for using things like battering rams, catapults, trebuchets, those kinds of machines of war. Next up, you get new snares and hazards, and again, there's a variety of options here, but probably my favorite is the new level 20 snare, the Death Coils. Basically, do you remember those Stasian electricity coils we talked about earlier? Yeah, use those as a trap to fry your enemies. You get some utility gear in this chapter as well, and a good example of that is the Clockwork Diving Suit. And this chapter also covers gear that helps with mobility, such as the Traveler's Wheelchair. Now, mobility gear and disabilities and storytelling, that is its own separate conversation, and I actually did a couple of videos on that topic, so if you would like a deep dive into my thoughts on disability and storytelling and the use of disabilities in storytelling, check out this video up here. I am glad that Paizo is offering the support to use these kinds of characters, but there is some nuance in how such characters should be used that they don't really dive into in this book. So if you're looking for more conversation on that aspect of the story, I encourage you to check out the videos I've done previously. And then, last but not least in this chapter, vehicles. The armored carriage, the steam cart, the clockwork castle. They have provided a variety of new, entertaining, and amazing vehicles. You all know I love vehicles. It's one of my favorite things in any RPG system, so you know I've been devouring this particular chapter. But if you enjoy vehicles, if you are looking for more options for vehicles in Pathfinder 2e, they've got several options for you here, and it is definitely something that I appreciate. But we could talk about all of the crazy new gear all day. Let's move on to Chapter 3 and switch from gears to guns. Let's talk about guns characters. The core of this chapter is the new class, the Gunslinger. And the Gunslinger is a dexterity-focused martial class that in some ways may actually start competing with the fighter in Pathfinder 2e. A lot of people have noted that the fighter kind of stands alone in its ability to gain legendary proficiency with weapons. Well, not anymore. The Gunslinger is now a class that can also gain legendary proficiency in at least some weapons, firearms. What you expect with this class is probably what you're going to get. A dexterity class that tends to focus on ranged combat. Firearms as a whole in Pathfinder 2e really seem to follow along the fishing for critical hits mechanic, if you will. So you can expect to see a lot of that with the Gunslinger class. The subclasses of the Gunslinger are divided into different ways. The way of the Drifter, the way of the Pistolero, the way of the Sniper, and the way of the Vanguard. The way of the Drifter is the Gunslinger subclass that focuses on being effective both at ranged and in melee combat, so you sort of mix different types of weapons. The Pistolero, in my mind, draws from a lot of old Western movies and stereotypes where you focus on being a specific distance from your enemy and sort of maximizing your focus on dueling them. The Sniper is exactly what you think it is, the rifle user that pegs you from a mile away. They can't hit anything from this distance! True story, that's actually based off old Kentucky long rifles. And then the Vanguard is the Gunslinger variant that focuses on heavier weapons and munitions. And if I wanted to dive deeper, I would have to start talking about all the class feats and different things, so that's not the purpose of this review. Overall, I just want to say that I absolutely love the Gunslinger. It is very high adventure, it's very over the top in the ways that I love to be over the top, and between the Gunslinger and the Inventor, I really feel like the Gunslinger is just, it's my favorite of the two in this book. They nailed the flavor of this class. There's not much else to talk about in terms of overview, but just know there are plenty of entertaining options here. Much like in Chapter 1 with the Gears characters, Chapter 3 offers gun characters a variety of new backgrounds, both common and rare, and probably my favorite rare background in the game right now, which is Tall Tale. I am rolling a goblin with the Tall Tale rare background at some point. I promise you it is happening. This chapter also comes with 10 different gun-flavored archetypes. One of them is the Gunslinger multi-class archetype, which is one that you would expect. And one of the archetypes is the Way of the Spell Shot. It's a class archetype for Gunslinger. Honestly, I feel like they should have just worked that into the base class and not had it as a separate class archetype. Don't get me wrong, I love the Way of the Spell Shot, and I totally want to play one, but I don't know if they should have pulled it out and made it a separate archetype. I don't know if there's enough there to justify that particular choice, but I definitely still enjoy it. But there are a variety of other gun-related archetypes in this chapter as well, such as the Artillerist and the Beast Gunner. But probably my favorite is actually the, I guess, monk-oriented archetype, the Bullet Dancer. If you have ever seen the movie Equilibrium and the Grammaton Clerics from that movie, that's what Bullet Dancer is. And oh my, I am so excited. That is one of my favorite movies that didn't get the love it deserved. And the ability to pull the characters from that movie into a Pathfinder game, I'm over the moon for that. All in all, there are a lot of good character options here. And that last archetype that I discussed actually brings up an important point. And that is, firearms are not their own unique proficiency in this chapter. Some firearms are simple, some firearms are martial, some firearms are advanced, but potentially any class can actually use firearms if they have the right simple, martial, or advanced proficiency. And Paizo did this on purpose. They wanted multiple character classes to be able to use firearms. They didn't just want to reserve firearms for the gunslinger only. Yes, the gunslinger can certainly push firearms a lot farther than other classes, but they intended for these rules to be available to all characters, not just to a select few. And that, honestly, in my mind, is a very good design decision. Of course, if you're going to have characters centered around guns, then you need some guns for them to use, and that's where Chapter 4, Guns Equipment, comes into play. This chapter is, as you would expect, filled with different, options of guns for people to use. You have classic guns, you have fantasy guns, you have different types of ammunition. You've got a wide variety of stuff, but it is worth noting that they open this section up by talking about where they drew the line in terms of the type of guns that they use. They specifically mention that things like revolvers or World War I era guns are not part of the options in this book. They essentially state that while there may be certain guns, certain weapons that are more advanced than the options in this book, that the production capacity to reproduce those weapons to make the appropriate ammunition does not exist on Golarion. So if there is something more advanced, it is an extremely rare novelty item that is most likely not going to see use. So before they dive into the weapons, they do take some time to kind of set the stage of these are the types of weapons you can expect. But from there, you'll get classic firearms such as a flintlock pistol or a flintlock musket, as well as more uncommon firearms or more specialized weapons such as a dwarven scattergun. They introduce a rare type of magical guns called beast guns, which actually come from the secretive continent of Arcadia, and they also offer rules for combination weapons such as the axe musket. They offer rare and unique and magical firearms, including cursed firearms for the game master who is feeling just a little bit evil. And if you're a longtime fan of this channel, you will probably not be surprised to learn that my favorite gun in the entire book is the Pistol of Wonder. Pull the trigger? Who knows what's going to happen? They have a section on ammunition covering everything from basic black powder ammunition to various special forms of ammunition. One of my favorites is the fairy bullet that leaves a trail of glitter dust as it flies through the air. And then they have a section on black powder siege weapons, giving you rules for things like cannons and bombards. They have a section on different firearm-related tools, such as bandoliers and scopes. And they also offer rules for firearm-related talismans and other special or magical items that you might expect to see in the Golarion setting that have been customized for use with firearms. Probably one of my favorite talismans is the Shrieking Skull talisman, which you can affix to a firearm or a crossbow, and when you fire it, the skull launches out with the bullet, screaming at your enemies as it flies through the air. Basically, there is a wide variety of gear and options and tools. If you have a character who is interested in exploring the world of firearms, there is definitely a ton of great equipment in this chapter, and I really appreciate the variety of options that Paizo gave us in this chapter. It would have been really easy for Paizo to overlook things like talismans for firearms. Honestly, I probably would have forgotten something like that, but talismans are part of the rule set for Pathfinder 2e, and the fact that Paizo took the time to make sure that they covered all of these different niches in the rules is honestly a testimony to how well done this book is. But that covers the first 4 chapters and the majority of the player-focused content that you can find in Guns and Gears. So, Chapter 1 and 2, that's gear characters and gear equipment. Chapter 3 and 4 is gun characters and gun equipment. And overall, I just want to say the variety, the versatility, the thoroughness of this book in terms of presenting just a variety of options to players, I genuinely appreciate how much effort Paizo put into making those 4 chapters something that players can sink their teeth into. I think there is a ton of content here, and I can see players getting incredible mileage out of the first 4 chapters. But, Game Masters, don't worry, there is some content for you too. Chapter 5, The Rotating Gear. This is a discussion of the setting of Golarion and where and how firearms fit into that setting. This chapter is going to include sections on the Dwarven Sky Citadel of Dungenhold and the human settlement of Alkenstar. It talks about Absalom, the city at the center of the world, and about unique gear-related innovations such as the Clockwork Citadel. They actually talk about the continent of Arcadia, and I think this book has the first official published map of the continent of Arcadia. And as part of the discussion of this continent, it talks about a region known as the Deadshot Lands and the magical beast guns that residents of that continent have learned how to construct and use. There's a discussion of the Jiska Imperium of old, which has connotations for the automaton ancestry that we discussed earlier. And even though the Jiska Imperium is no more, you get an idea for how the remnants of that society continue to influence Golarion. They talk a little bit about the shackles and basically pirate ships battling each other by cannon fire. Not going to complain about that. You also get a discussion of the birthplace of black powder in Golarion, which is Tianjia, and how firearms fit into that particular portion of the setting. And then finally you get a discussion of the nation of Ustalov, and a little bit of a hint of the goings-on in Irison as well, as it relates to Stasian technology, the Tesla coils that we discussed earlier. So basically, as a storyteller, they give you a lot of content if you want to know where and how to add tech into your Pathfinder 2e games. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and say that the section on Dungenhold and the city of Alkenstar, I feel like Paizo is setting up a future adventure path with the stuff they wrote in that chapter. Other Game Masters, if you have read that section, let me know if you agree. I feel like they are straight up setting up an adventure path. They have laid some groundwork for a campaign if I have ever seen it. All in all, as a storyteller, there are definitely some great hooks, some great opportunities, some great options presented if you want to make use of technological themes in your stories. So I really appreciate Chapter 5, but I want to say this real quick. It is not just for storytellers. Chapter 5 includes a section on Dungenhold dwarf ancestry feats. The Dungenhold Sky Citadel is one of the most prominent locations for firearms in the Golarion setting, and dwarves that come from that particular Sky Citadel have access to some uncommon ancestry feats that they can use to help tie them to that particular story and that particular aspect of the setting. So even players may find a lot of interesting content in this particular section. And that is all 5 chapters of Guns and Gears. This book is amazing. I thoroughly applaud Paizo for the quality of this book, and this is, in my opinion, the best player resource that Paizo has published. Now, again, the caveat I gave earlier in this video, if you are not interested in technology, if you are not interested in firearms being a part of your game, obviously this is not the book for you. But if you enjoy firearms, if you enjoy technology, if you enjoy steampunk, If you grew up on Final Fantasy like me and you enjoy integrating fantasy and technology into the same setting, I think Paizo has delivered a top-notch product here, and I am already getting excellent use out of this book. As I mentioned, I've already got one player who is playing an Inventor and is getting some good mileage out of the book. And I feel like there's a lot of other content in this book that I'm going to be able to use. In particular, for my current campaign, siege engines and vehicles are something that I, as a game master, I know I'm going to make use of that. This book is good. Now, I will admit again that there's probably a little bias showing through in what I'm saying here because these types of stories appeal to me. This is very much in my wheelhouse, so I appreciate Paizo doing such a phenomenal job with a type of content that I truly enjoy. But let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on Guns and Gears? Have you had a chance to read through this book? Do you agree with my assessment? Are there positive elements of this book that I have overlooked? Or are there negative aspects of this book that I failed to mention? Are you comfortable with firearms and technology in your fantasy stories? Or do you prefer to keep them separate? Let me know in the comments section down below. If you're interested in being a part of my Discord community, you can find a link to that in the video description. And I have a link to my Patreon page as well if you're interested in supporting the channel. If you enjoyed this video, like it, share it, subscribe, and definitely be a part of the conversation. Thank you so much for being here, and have a wonderful day.